Welcome to this latest episode of The Law's Two Bodies, a series of interviews with lawyers, practitioners, academics, judges, and people working in legally related fields. The title and some of the inspiration of the project comes from Sir John Baker's book of the same name. Central to the book is the argument that the common law is almost universally regarded as a system of case law, increasingly supplemented by legislation. But this is only partly true. There's an extensive body of lawyers' law, which has a real existence outside the formal sources, but is seldom acknowledged or discussed either by legal theorists or by legal historians. Our project asks the question, what is law? But pursues an answer in a fashion different from typical jurisprudential studies. It examines what legal practitioners do, how they regard law, to what extent they think about law in the abstract. The approach is ethnographic rather than philosophical or sociological. The aim is to build up a corpus of interviews with a variety of legal practitioners, concentrating on the issues outlined above. The interviews involve a set of questions posed to all interviewees. At present, the purpose is to stimulate thought rather than to produce any publication. The aim is to create a set of interesting case studies rather than a carefully representative sample of practitioners. And today we have with us Susan Page. So, Susan, can you tell us a little bit about your legal background, legal experience, legal career?
Sure. So I am more on the practitioner side. I practiced very briefly in private practice for about 6 months while I waited for my security clearance to go through to join the U.S. Department of State's Office of the Legal Advisor, and focuses on international public international law. And so I practiced in the Office of the Legal Advisor for political and military affairs for a few years, and then I joined the Foreign Service and served overseas. Ultimately serving as the first U.S. ambassador to South Sudan and chargé d'affaires to the African Union and our mission there, and a multitude of other posts. And then I also worked for the UN, both in legal roles as well as the head of the peacekeeping mission in Haiti.
And at the various stages of your career, how much of your time was spent on legal matters? Presumably it varied during your career?
It did. As much as I tried to run away from it at every possible turn, I just kept getting brought back. And one position after another was somehow rule of law related. And so while I was not a practitioner in the sense of arguing before a court or writing legal opinions for the legal advisor, it was a lot of interaction between the law and politics and policy. And then, of course, diplomacy and all the tools that we have in our diplomatic toolbox.
And when you're involved with these variety of legal matters in a variety of legal contexts, where do you get your knowledge of the law from? So
I developed, I don't think it's unusual, but everyone has to figure out what their strength is in diplomacy. So starting as a lawyer, I used my legal background and my legal training. I think one clear distinction is that the law school education does not, at least in the United States and where I went to law school at the time, 1,000 years ago, it was not about black letter law. It was really how you think about the law and law's place in a way in society. Why would we want to regulate a Saturday night special? Those sorts of things which align much more closely, in my view, towards policy. And this other body that we don't talk about so much. But so I would say, obviously, I get it from U.S. law and law that I studied and know, but serving overseas, even when I was not in a legal position, I wanted to know very clearly what the laws of the country were that I was also living and working in, because knowing their law, at least their constitution, if they had one, which in my case, all of the countries that I worked in did, except South Sudan, which had an interim constitution. But it was important for me to know that so that I could approach issues and say, but you need to also think that this is not the West proclaiming what you need to focus on, but your own constitution that says somehow you must value these core things as well.
You mentioned the idea of another body of law existing. How important, that clearly is important to you. How does it work?
Well, I mean, I think it works in the same way that we have a culture that surrounds all of these different actions that we do and work on, not just as lawyers, but in everything. So as I've listened to a lot of the interviews already, people talk about this other culture. So if you are a practicing attorney and you are a litigator, there's certain things that you need to know before you represent a client. Maybe it's partly strategy, but it could also be that je ne sais quoi, that something that's intangible, but that is going to help you win the case and might make you lose a case if you don't know that. And that comes with learning the culture of the environment that you're in. In my case, I use it as a way to, in a way, recenter the conversation to what the country's actors need to focus on. So even though it might be to further my country's national interest, I want them to buy into it, and not because I'm saying it and I represent, the big USA, but because, in fact, at some point, even if I know realistically, they may have literally just adopted the Constitution, changed the names, changed the structures to fit that was imposed upon them by a colonial power, but they have had 40, 50, 60, 70 years to have modified that, and some countries have, some countries haven't. So I can only take that to mean this, at some level, must have the buy-in of the people, or at least those who make the rules.
So would it be fair then, from what you've said, that it is a mixture of immersion and reflection, and tactical use, that the end purpose of the immersion and reflection isn't purely knowledge, it is pragmatic value?
Yeah, I mean, I think that every society and every organization has its own unwritten rules. And so the law is no different from those other organizations. But of course, the law is not a person, but you need to know how to operate within the environment that you're in. So in my case, I was not in a courtroom. I'm in an embassy, I'm in a ministry, I'm advising or influencing or trying to influence. So I have to use the tools that I have available. And that's the culture of the diplomatic world. So maybe I'm going to be able to accomplish something by working together with other diplomats. Maybe I'm going to be able to work better at achieving my objective if I go in and I have sort of the American flag behind me. Maybe if I'm trying to tell them something that we are not doing very well in our own country, I need to admit that and say, we have this issue at home, but here are some of the ways that we are trying to work on fixing those issues. But it's hard work. So I accept and understand that you're at that point, but it's one of those necessary processes that has to happen to move on to this. It's understanding the environment you're in and the context. And I think we all do that. So whether you're in a courtroom, whether you're performing some sort of transaction, you have to know, it's the first thing you do. Learn about the environment that you're going to go into.
This may be impossible to answer, but in trying to find out about that environment and working out what determines that environment, is a group of people, a certain size of group of people who determine this, or is that just impossible to estimate?
No, I don't think it's necessarily impossible to work out, but it does depend, and a lot of this is about power and the power dynamics, both within our own system, whatever system that you are working in, as well as the system that you are going to or trying to influence or change. And so I read as much as I can. I want to know about the history of the place, the history of other countries, because it's international and comparative to a certain extent. Why is the outcome here very different from what happened in a different country with the same colonial power? But who are the main influencers? And that can change too. It changes sometimes with different leaders. But generally speaking, those are things that there's a bit of a hierarchy everywhere. And who determines how things continue, you have to know who has power to make those changes, who influences them. Is there influence? Does this person act only on their own? Is it more presidential, where the president has lots of authority, versus presidential but lots of robust checks and balances? Is it a weak legislature? Okay, weak legislature, but there are certain key actors that really have weight and influence. Maybe I need to make sure that they're on board, listen to their thoughts. So it depends on each society, but there's stratification, class, however you want to call it, everywhere.
And clearly knowing about other legal systems is necessary to you from your work, but how far are you interested in it in a general way? I mean, would you be interested in legal systems of places you're not working in? And was there any extent to which an interest in other legal systems pushed you in the area that you ended up working in?
Yeah, I think it's important to me because as I started getting into more political work that was conflict resolution, mediation, negotiations, it was important to me to know, are there other things where maybe you had a conflict that also involved Islamic banking? How is it resolved in a country far away from the countries that I'm working on, but very relevant to what I'm working on right now? So I think there are lessons that can be learned. They have to be maybe tweaked and shaped for the context. But yeah, that's really important. But it's not just about the law and knowing other legal systems. Again, it's knowing where are the influences, not just who has power, but what is the media lens in a country? Are people getting the same information? And I'm really fascinated by other countries and other cultures. And how did this practice develop? I mean, I think if I had to do it over again, I would focus more on the anthropology, the social anthropology, not just on the history and the development of the law historically, but the anthropological changes that went along with that, or the sociological changes. I find rituals and practices like that just really, really telling.
That leads on to really the next two questions. How far are you interested in law in the abstract or abstract questions of law? And you've been talking very much, in some sense, pragmatically, though intellectually pragmatically, but do abstract notions of law interest you, and are they necessary to any of your work?
Abstractness is not my strong suit. I like definitions, I like structure. And that's where it's no longer abstract to me. And I try to use that in the way that I do my work, which is now really not so much law, even though if you're a political advisor or a head of an agency, an organization, you need to know what governs events. But at the end of the day, all of law is politics, to me. And that changes. People's attitudes and views change, sometimes for the good, sometimes for the bad. And that's why, to me, it's not abstract, because there are real people at the end of it. And that's not abstract.
You mentioned history a few minutes ago, and partly the history of the law and partly the history of the places you were working in. Are there advantages in knowing the history of the law of the place, or is this again something that is a useful adjunct but not essential?
Oh, I think it's really critically important, because a lot of things were imposed on places. We were talking earlier about the form of law. So the colonizers went into these countries where they had existing practices, laws, traditions. It's not to say that everything was perfect, but they had a structure that generally worked, and where people were, the leaders were selected by their own communities, and there were checks and balances, and they lived there. They were close to the people. But that was not a model that the powers wanted to replicate, because they wanted to take over. But they wanted a form that would make it look legal and that could be acceptable far away and more broadly. So what was sovereignty was defined as independent nation states. Well, these states, guess what? We're not independent nation states. And so let's have a colonizing mission. But their notion of behaviors was very different. So we want women to do this and men to do that. That's how it's done. Well, not necessarily. And what people don't understand oftentimes is that there was a rich culture, but over time that became eroded, because that's not what the colonial powers wanted. So we talk about development. Well, sure, they built a road to a highway maybe, or a paved road, only from one place to the airport to extract the goods that they wanted to take them out for the benefit of Europe or the North or the West or whatever, global North, not to develop the area for the local people. So, but if you don't know that, you walk in and you assume all of these things, because we all have our biases. We don't know. And when you don't teach history, or you teach only a certain part of history, like, why do we teach history starting post-slavery? Well, because that part of the story is not so pretty.
So your history of law that you are investigating is it's a very broad combination of what you mentioned, the anthropology, the history, in a sense the more strictly defined legal history, the politics and political culture. Is that right?
Maybe not just political culture, but culture, maybe minus the caveat, because there are all kinds of cultures. So, small example, when I was in Botswana, the people of Botswana and a lot of southern African nations eat worms. It's a certain kind of worm called a palmy worm. And most people's natural, and I say that because that would be, from our context, a natural reaction would be, ew, gross, they eat crickets, they eat worms. But how did that activity develop? Well, actually, they're very good for protein. And if you live in a big, vast, wide open society where lots and lots of land, but scarcely populated, maybe you're not going to get meat that often, but your body needs it. This is a great way. This is cheap, it's available, you can eat them boiled, fried, etc. But you have to understand that society and not make the faux pas for us culturally to them. If you turn up your nose or the chief invites you for dinner and you refuse to eat that, that's not good. So it's important to know that how these things developed and why that's a practice. So you don't have to like it, but you have to at least understand how that came to be. And in a lot of places, some of these foods, just speaking of food alone, developed because people were given the scraps, the leftovers, the inners, right? The lining of food. So in Scotland, it's haggis. In the US, in a lot of places, it's chitlins. Of course, they're spelled chitterlings, but that's not what black people call them. They're called chitlins. But today, while that was something that in the past was like the only thing that you could get that was given to you, so you had to make it taste good. You added sauces and spices and whatnot. Well, today, now you have to go buy it in a grocery store, and what was previously something very awful is now a delicacy.
The last question we ask relates probably more clearly to your work than, or necessarily to your work than it does to some others, which is thinking about the relationship of emotions and law. Is part of the function of law to take out emotion from dispute, or is it to channel or direct or formulate emotion within disputes? So what's the relation there?
Again, we're human beings. It's human beings who are putting forward, whether it's arguments or doing the storytelling. It's hard not to be emotional. But there are some areas where emotions are not supposed to be on display. But it's also, even that has its own culture around it, right? So some people are called emotional if they act in a certain way, but a different gender acts in the exact same way, that's not emotional. So, all of these terms are a bit loaded. But, I bring who I am to what I'm doing. And part of the emotion is I have to understand the wrong that people feel that has brought them to war, to actual war. And what would I be willing to give up for that cause if I were in their shoes? So, you have to empathize. You absolutely have to.
That's what I was going to go and ask. It's part of your learning about the society culture in working out the emotional codes, emotional norms, and trying at least to understand them in some way.
Yes. And that's where history and the culture around things is really, really important.
Thank you. That has been really interesting.